Hi, welcome to Understanding Conscious Cryptids with me, Kat Hansen, your host. Hi everyone, it's me, Kat. Welcome to Understanding Conscious Cryptids. Today's lesson will be the second part of the lesson on giants, so it's Giants Part 2. And in this one, I kind of want to get a little bit deeper in what we are told about these beings. Yesterday, when I did Part 1, I explained that they lived up on the high ridges. And if anybody knows anything about the beings that I talk about, the face eaters, they also live up there, which I find to be very coincidental to me. And for this reason, they say that the giants lived up on the high ridges. They had their stone fortifications up there that they lived behind. You know, they were able to keep themselves safe behind these fortifications, these walls. And it's interesting to me because the science today, modern science, says that they did not exist, but yet they did have all these remains that they found in the southeast section of the United States, from the time that they were settled until early 1900s, when they were still finding skeletal remains of giants. So, to me, it's interesting that people in the science world, in the archaeology world, don't acknowledge them, when in fact we do have quite a bit of evidence pertaining to them and showing that they did exist. Anyway, I wanted to say that with them living up there, if archaeologists would take the time to go up on these high ridges, to trek up there, I'm willing to bet dollars to donuts that they would find the remains that I'm talking about, because I have done this. And there are pieces of pottery, very primitive pottery, arrowheads, spear tips, pieces of leather thong. They're so old and ancient, but at the same time, they still exist. It's interesting to me as well that they don't take into account the ancestral native history that surrounds these beings. It's not just one group of people speaking about them, it's many of the Native American tribes that were here indigenous to the North American continent. And when I say indigenous, I'm not saying it in the sense that they existed here and just sprung up from the earth here. For instance, my people, the Choctaw legends, say that after we crossed the Mississippi River, we ran into the giants. They were here already before us, but they roamed. Certain tribes of them roamed the North American and South American continent as well. But the ones that we ran into came from the east. After we had crossed the Mississippi River, we ran into them, and they came from the east, and they used mammoth as beasts to carry their things, beasts of burden, you know. So that in and of itself is pretty interesting. People don't understand that when we speak of this, we're not saying something that's false. We keep these legends, if you want to call them that. I don't call them that. I call them information streams. We keep these legends alive, and so that our people were able to communicate with other tribal members of different tribes so that they were able to understand what we were running into, because we did not have telephones and the internet, as a way to keep knowledge and spread it. So we had to use it verbally and make sure that it was kept straight so that we could pass it on to other tribal members so that they could be kept safe, and therefore they could pass it on. It was our knowledge stream that we kept going, and it's an information line, and it was so vital to have this information line about these guys because they were very cannibalistic, antagonistic. They wanted nothing more than to rape, pillage, plunder, and eat. That was their way of living, and in studying the giants, I've come to the conclusion that what the Chata people ran into were remnants already of these beings. They had some forms of society because we did talk about them. They lived up high on the ridges, like I said. And then once they were destroyed, in the process of being eradicated, when all the tribes started banding together, what you ran into then in the aftermath were the giants that lived along the rivers, and they had their villages, and that's what I'm going to call them, because they were villages. Even though they were pretty elaborate, they were still villages. And this was a degeneration of them. We called them the sand people because they always lived along those river banks. They were further back, but a river bank you could pull into and then walk back, and then the village was there, so that they could see the river from their village. And to me, that speaks volumes, because they expected, in a tactical sense, that they could possibly be attacked from the river. So either they were thinking it that way, or they used to use the rivers as a way to attack other tribes. And there again, if you go back through the histories, you're going to find that a lot of times they talk about the giants that were seen along the rivers, and still to this day they are seen along the rivers. It's a vital source of water, but it's also a way for them to see what's coming and take to the river to get away fast, And by that I'm saying, if you are a large being, you leave footprints, okay? You're massive, you're going to leave these footprints. And these guys were massive. There were some that were so tall that men only came up to their knees. So these are the big guys, And the easiest way for them to get away without leaving a track is to walk down the river and go through the river, and walk down it. They're not going to leave any form of a track. So these guys were very smart. They weren't dumb in any sense, even though they were cannibalistic. People tend to associate cannibals with very primitive peoples, and that's not the case with these guys. These guys were able to continuously devolve, okay, to the point where they were, some of them, not all of them, some of them were assimilated into the Native American tribes, the shorter ones, the 10-foot tall guys. And I know this to be true because my own tribe has the legends of them. And my grandfather, my own grandfather, was one of those that was descended from a union between a Native American Chata woman from one tribe to him. And it's interesting to me because his lineage talks about how the giant, his father, was welcomed into their group. His father's father, just it keeps going back further and further, how they were all welcomed into the groups. And my own grandfather was welcomed somewhat into my tribe, which is interesting to me because he was so large. And the stories that I know about him make me laugh because of how big he is. My dad and my uncles are all over the 6'5", all the way up to the 6'9" height level. And then you have my grandfather, who was, as near as my grandmother could figure, about 7 to 7.5 feet tall. And he was so large that he could take his hand and put it over another man's head, and his thumb would touch that man's chin, and his fingers would reach all the way to the back of that man's head, down at the base of the neck. So he was very tall and very wide and broad. My grandmother spoke of him in the sense that he had given her all these large children, the extremely tall men and women, that it wore her out, body-wise, carrying these babies. And then to have to feed all these people, she finally reached a limit when my uncles were around the 12, 13-year-old mark. And according to her words, she put my grandfather out because he ate too much. Which makes me laugh because my father, I remember it was nothing for my father to eat a dozen to a dozen and a half eggs every morning for his breakfast. My uncles were the same way. That's why we had many chickens, many pheasants, ducks, and geese, because they were big guys and they needed to eat. I'm not talking about skinny, tall guys. I'm talking about big, strapping, 6.5 feet to 7 feet tall guys. 3 feet across. What do you call it? 2 to 3 feet across the shoulders. These guys were huge. And these are my dad. This is my dad and my uncles. So to associate them with the giants is another part of my own ancestry. Okay, and to me, it just relates back to how these giant people, these giant humanoids that were here, were assimilated into the Native American tribes. Not all of them, but some of them did. And if you go through their histories and study, you will find out that these giants that did come to be assimilated into their tribes were descendants of the giants themselves. So it's interesting in the fact that while they were this large, they were still very intelligent, very cognizant, able to bring something, to the tribe that they came to. They were able to do skills. So that tells you right there they were still intelligent, because the tribal members are not just going to adopt some dumb brute into their midst because they will have to feed him. They're going to have to clothe him and help him. So he needs to be a productive member for them to assimilate him. So these guys were, the descendants were still very much cognizant of what they were doing. They had the skills, life skills, etc., to survive. So the de-evolution that occurred, as far as I can figure, didn't happen with all of the tribes of the giants. It happened with some of them, and remember, my people call them the Holo, so I refer to them oftentimes. So I'm kind of stuttering here, skipping back and forth between the vernacular of English to Chata, so that you guys understand what I'm talking about. Anyhow, the legends, which always are based on truth. I don't care what anybody says. If you sit down and study the legend, you're going to find the grain of truth that's in it, that started it. And I believe that humans do legends to make them entertaining, so that way we are aware of what's going on in the legend, and we always keep the legend because it was so entertaining and informative, so we pass it along to the next generation or to other tribes that we run into. So it's very important to understand that each legend has a grain of truth in it when you're discussing these things. As well, I want to talk about the different groups of them. We have the very, very tall guys. These guys had white hair. Okay, these guys were not the ones that were assimilated into the tribe. These are the ones that were specifically tried to be wiped out. They were very big, very large, in the 20-foot tall range. They had white hair. Men came up to around their knee to the midst of their thigh. So they were very large, but they were also very cannibalistic, not intelligent. These guys had language skills, and these are the guys that built the fortifications up on top of the ridges up there, and lived up high so they could look down and make sure what was coming, see what's coming, much like I do with me. I live on the mountain because I would prefer to look down and see what's coming rather than have it just up here. I learned my lesson a long time ago about that. I need to see things coming. So these guys were also the same way. Their villages and fortifications were on the top of the ridges, ridge walkers, whatever you want to call them. The next set that came as descendants of them were not as tall, and these guys got to be right around the 10, 12, 15 foot mark. Still looking very much human, but just larger skills, larger. So they were this degenerative group that came down, and they evolved, descended, whatever you want to call it, from the 25-footers. These guys were a little bit more civilized in that they were actively looking for people to add to their own stock, and to help them make tools. They mined, they did a lot of things, and yes, I'm going to speak about all of that. And this one's going to be a long video, so I better warn everybody. These second generation giants were intelligent enough to promote the fact that they needed to be productive and to have a certain amount of skills. So these are the guys that were mining here on the North American continent, and we find a lot of evidence from them being here and mining copper, silver, gold, things like that. They're ancient mines, and they're all over the North American continent, but they are predominantly in the upper northeast of the United States. So the Native American tribes up there had to interact with these guys. And if you ever study this, you're going to realize that beings that could pick up a 25-pound to 30-pound rock hammer, and sit there and work with it all day long, that tells you that's not a normal human being, because just picture trying to pick up a Thanksgiving turkey, or, that's something that weighs, anywhere from 15 to 20 pounds. Okay, and you know how heavy that is, and you picture holding that and just sitting there all day long, banging on rock to mine. It's not, a human can't do that. But a normal-sized human cannot do that. But a very large humanoid that's, 12 feet tall, 15 feet tall, can do this with no problem. And that's what they've found, that these tools that they have are all oversized, but they still are within the human shape of a tool range. So these guys were pretty tall, and as they came down off the ridges, the Native American tribes were still, many of them were not interested in interacting with them unless they were going to be more civilized and not cannibalistic. So the cannibalism was being phased out in their society, and these guys were being moved further and further down off the ridges into open areas, so that way they could interact with the Native American tribes already. Then the next generation, we have, as I said, these guys were being systematically devolved size-wise, but they were also being, at the same time with interaction with the Native American tribes, they were being given knowledge and intelligence and ways to survive without being warlike, without being cannibalistic. In between the generations, we have legends talking about how they were destroyed, etc. And that's pretty much the truth. But there's also ways to expound upon that truth and to dig through the legends and realize that not all of them were attacked and killed. Okay, most of them, I want to say like 99% of them, were wiped out. And then we have the others that started over from them. So these guys did learn that being cannibalistic was not an okay thing, and it really did provoke hard feelings between all the tribes. So they were taught not to be this way and to be accepted. So in being accepted, their whole society crumbles and they are integrated into the next society. And that is the human way. That is what we as Homo sapiens do. We tend to grab something, and if it's of use to us, we take it, we integrate it, and we assimilate it. And that's what we have done with the giants that were existing here on the North American continent. There are many legends that talk about how the big guys, the 20-footers, 25-footers, were destroyed, and I'm not going to go into that because I'm sure everybody knows those. I mean, they're all over the internet, and people have just beat them to death, with the legends. But the point that I want to make is that if you're integrated and assimilated into a culture, your culture is now gone, but your memory of that culture is still there. And you relate the stories that you know, and the instances and the happenstance that you keep that, and you tell your children, and therefore they tell their children. And that's how the legends of the giants have kept alive. These guys were not dumb, as I said. There's many instances of finding the tools, the clothing, what is it, 10, I can't remember the number, it's 2,000 to 20,000 pairs of sandals, being found in a cave in Nevada. That tells you that they had open trade amongst themselves, because a need for that many sandals tells you that these guys were traveling all over the continent, and maybe even off of the continent down to the South American continent where they have legends of these guys, and they were taking tools and they were taking clothing and they were obviously trading it to other giant tribes. So there was a chain of these people that existed, and this is a race of people because they're humanoids. Okay, they're very human, but they're just, I don't know what to call it, king size. They're king size human beings that have cannibalistic properties. Okay, and it was not acceptable, so the smaller in stature humanoids, Homo sapiens, attacked them and pretty much wiped them out and integrated, found ways to kill them so that way they could integrate the ones that were doing acceptable things, the ones that were not eating other people, and openly trading with other people, and things that we know that they should be doing. They were doing everything right, so the Native American tribes assimilated them. And yes, I do believe that it's already been shown that they were assimilated, because if you take the DNA samples, the genetic samples, you find out that there are markers in it that come from all over the United States. So you have not just the United States, but other continents where they came from. And that makes sense because the Native American legends talk about them arriving from the ocean, from the east, and then they came and swept through. And that's what we use as a verbal legend, because we talk about how they came and just wiped everything out. And that makes sense because they were so large. They wiped every food stand, every food thing, everything, that they could. Women, children, animals, they didn't care, and that's what the legends say. They were so big, they had to be fed, and I can imagine if they were coming from the east on rafts. Imagine being that big and having to be at sea. I'm sure you would go through your food stores that quick, they would be gone, because you're feeding yourself and others. So obviously what comes next, the next step is either you find a way to find land or you're all going to die. Well, you're not finding land just yet, so you start eating each other, and that's pretty much how the story goes. So people who don't believe that the giants were here have not studied their history and have not studied the evidence for them, because the evidence that does exist here on the North American continent is overwhelming. The graves that they've discovered, the tools that they've discovered, the tombs, the burial sites, etc., that they discovered. People always say, well, there's no evidence of that. Yeah, there is. There is written evidence of what was discovered here in the United States, starting from around the 1700s. That is overwhelming proof that they were here. I'm trying to think of the name of it. There's a book called The Indigenous History of the Giants here on the North American continent. And it was written by gentlemen in the late 1700s who discovered, they were talking about these mounds that they had discovered of these giants. So it's here, the history's here, but just because it's old, over 200 years old, doesn't mean it's not viable evidence. It is viable, it's just that it has been lost. Because think of how many things that have happened here in our own society. We've had floods, natural disasters, earthquakes. We've had the Depression. We just had so much in American history that has occurred since the 1700s, that evidence for these guys that existed then, it's only natural to have been lost, because we can't maintain that history. It's going to get lost naturally through the exchange of hands to different museums, collectors, etc. So the chain has been broken, but the evidence that it existed is still there, because there's verbal evidence, there's pictures, things like that that document it still exist, that show that there were giants here on the North American continent. So, that being said, that's the end of this lesson. I will be talking eventually about them and the mounds that people found the 7-foot to 10-foot tall giants in. And those are the ones that were assimilated into the other tribes. So I want to make sure that everyone knows exactly what I'm talking about when I start talking about them. And I will recap, because it's really important that people understand the different sizes and types that were here. Well, that should do it for today. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I hope that you found this lesson to be productive. If you liked it, please give me a thumbs up. Likes are always appreciated, and if you care to visit my Patreon page, the link is in the description, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you to my supporters. As always, I really appreciate the help.